Okay, so for this lecture for ENIGMA-U, I want to talk about ethical issues in behavioral science. And so ethics is a very broad area. It encompasses a wide range of research concerns, anything from subject recruitment to consenting, the ethical procedures of your method. I'm going to focus in this talk on IRB recruitment and consenting. And so the first thing I'd like to define is the Institutional Review Board. You may have heard of this before, but an IRB is each institution will have their own IRB, and it's a committee that reviews research involving human subjects specifically. So if you're studying in geology or other areas of science without humans, IRB is not needed. But when we work with people, there are additional ethical concerns that we have to abide by. And so the IRB sits to review submissions that allow us to engage in human subjects research. And so how do you know if you need to submit? Well, if the research is systematic investigation designed to develop and advance our understanding of knowledge or advanced knowledge, and it includes human subjects, you're probably going to have IRB review. And the IRB goes so far as to even define what a human subject is, and including the Department of Health and Human Services, a living individual. An investigator conducting research gains data through intervention or interaction and or identifiable private information. And research is defined as a systematic investigation, including research development, testing, and evaluation, and it's designed to develop or contribute to a body of knowledge. And so examples of research are federally funded research projects, graduate theses and dissertations, surveys, interviews, or observations, as you'd see in the social sciences, and studies that utilize test subjects for new devices, drugs, or materials, so in the biomedical sphere. Not research would be any activity or class project intended only to receive a grade in the course. Of course, if the results are ultimately used beyond the classroom, you'd need an IRB. You could also do some assessment within a program to determine improvements. So you might have evaluations in a business or at school, but those are really internal, and those would not require an IRB. Or projects where the results, pardon me, are not intended to contribute to a generalizable body of knowledge. You're not trying to advance the understanding of a phenomenon. So the three questions to balance in ethical decisions are: what are the consequences? Whose interests are involved? Who do you affect? And what are the principles or rules that apply? And so what are the consequences? What are the benefits and risks? And you want to consider those benefits and risks over short and long-term windows of time. Whose interests are involved? Who would benefit from the research? Who will be at risk from the research? Who's responsible? And who has the power? And most of the time, the answer to who has the power, it's the researcher. The participants are, there's a power differential, and the researchers maintain that most commonly. And so you want to consider whose interests are involved. And then what are the principles that apply with regard to respect for persons, minimizing harm, and then also trying to work to guarantee justice and fair treatment of all participants. And just to give you one example of where research ethics were clearly violated, there's just a really sort of egregious violation in the study linking childhood vaccines and autism. And a paper retracted. It was first published in a high-profile journal, The Lancet, which is sort of the equivalent of the New England Journal of Medicine in Europe. And it was first published in this highly visible journal and then had to be later retracted. And the reasons were that the authors made a number of mistakes in the method, and they weren't entirely transparent in their process, including not disclosing that the lead author didn't disclose they had paid one of the advisors in legal cases involving families suing vaccine manufacturers, handpicked the children for research rather than including patients encountered in a clinic, had paid some of the kids at the son's birthday party to give blood. So this was really outside the typical scenarios where you conduct legitimate research. And it was published in, again, a very highly visible, revered journal, and it carried a lot of weight. And so you can imagine the question at the bottom here, what are the principles violated here? There are unfortunately a number of them, which we'll get to. In particular, recruitment is one we're going to talk about. How do you bring in participants, volunteers for your study in an ethical way? And so you want to encourage people to participate in your research, but how do you do this without coercion? And coercion is where you have been overly convincing, arm twisting, in order to enroll participants in your study. And ultimately, participation has to be a choice. It has to be something that most of the time in our work, people are pretty excited to participate in the research. They want to find out about the scientific process. They want to learn about themselves. It really shouldn't be a situation where somebody doesn't really want to participate, but they are involved in your study. One form of coercion would be to oversell some of the benefits to the individual. And one would be money, but there are other ways. And so for this advertisement, for example, this would not be passed by the IRB because of the overemphasis of being paid. You can mention reimbursement for a study, but it wouldn't be done in this way. And so I've given you the answer to this question: why is the advertisement likely to pass the IRB or not? And this is probably not going to get through most IRBs. One thing I should note is that IRBs are different at all institutions. And so while I would say 90+% would say no to this, there are some differences in what IRBs emphasize. So your typical recruitment material should show affiliation with the institution. So I'm at Penn State University, and all of our materials say Penn State. You should make very clear that recruitment is for volunteers. You are volunteering to be part of the research. And you have to make very clear the inclusion-exclusion criteria. So what are the requirements, the minimum requirements for somebody to be a part of the study? And if anybody is under the age of 18, then you would need a parental signature. You want to provide a brief statement about the tasks and the time commitment. Is this going to be 2 hours or 2 months that they're involved, right? This is important information for somebody to make an educated decision about their involvement. Incentives can't be larger or more central on the flyer or may be deemed coercive, as the example I showed in the last slide. So coercion can also occur in other more subtle ways, like social persuasion, sort of implied exchange, unconfirmable offers for free or cutting-edge treatment, where that may not be the case. Status and relationships, so leveraging power is unfortunately can happen in situations where researchers don't really realize the power they have. For example, they're faculty and they're recruiting a student in their own class. This is something we have to be very careful with regard to study recruitment. Must have option to say no to the research and or skip parts or stop anytime. And this last part's really important. Even after somebody is involved in the study, they sign a consent form, which I'll touch on in a minute here. They can discontinue at any juncture. But one of the most well-recognized and egregious examples of unethical scientific discovery was the Tuskegee syphilis study. And it ran for over 4 decades. And it was a federally funded study where 600 African-American males were injected with syphilis and not treated. And they were also not informed they were injected with syphilis in order to determine the ultimate outcome of that disease. They did have a choice, but they were misinformed. They were told they were being treated for bad blood. And this was a nationally funded study, it's a federally funded study. And more information, you can see the link below if you want to read more about it. But this study started in 1932, and it went on for a very long time with 600 Black men, 399 with syphilis. And even after penicillin became available in the 1940s, these men were not made aware of it and they did not have access to it. And so many died. And it wasn't until 1972 when the first news articles broke, the study was ended. And then 25 years later, President Clinton issued an apology, a formal presidential apology. This is, there may be others, but to my knowledge, this is the most egregious, malicious example of scientific misconduct in the history of the United States. The reason why I present this is, first of all, we shouldn't forget that this happened, but secondly, it's a reminder that scientific misconduct can happen at any level and anywhere. Yeah, the federal funding, the notoriety of the scientist, none of that really matters. If you see something that doesn't look right, it's probably not right, and so pay attention to that. So let's use one example as a recruitment case. Let's talk about, given that we're talking about recruitment. In this example, there's a student named Jonah who wants to gather pilot data for a thesis. A psychology instructor said he'd offer 10 points extra credit for the students to participate. Jonah is the teaching assistant for that psychology instructor. And right before the next exam, he tells the students how much he'd appreciate their participation. What conflicts are there here with respect to recruitment? And you can pause it now and think about it, and then I'll give you an answer. Or I can at least describe what has been reviewed in our course. Okay, so hopefully you thought a little bit about the nature of the timing of when Jonah is asking to recruit. So he's the TA for a course, and the students are sitting in, about ready to take an exam. He's in some ways has influence on their grade. And now he's asked if they will join his study, and he'd really appreciate their participation. So the conflict really is coercion might be a strong word, but students might feel overly compelled to join for fear that because Jonah has some capacity to influence their grade, that he might do that. Now, Jonah, of course, it could be a well-meaning individual and have no intention of doing that, but it's really about the timing of the request. And so what he might do instead is offer this outside the class or have somebody else present that to the students in the class as opposed to him, and have it so that he's separate from that request. That might be one way to handle this. In another case, an individual named Gordon's doing a daily diary study for 10 days and how daily stress is related to alcohol use. On the recruitment materials online, the consent, offers $30 to participate. He notices that his first group of participants stopped filling out the survey after day 3. And so this should go on for longer than this, 10 days. He gets data for about 3 days. First question is, does he need to pay them the full amount? And then what should he do to incentivize completion, but not without being coercive? So you can go ahead and hit the pause button and think about that. Okay, these are two sort of separate issues. The first is, does he still need to pay them? The answer is yes, if in the consent form, when the participants were consented, they were told they'd be paid $30. Because remember, you could stop anytime. So this is tough for this study because you may find that 10 days is too long. Subjects are dropping out. And so what could he do to incentivize completion, but not without being coercive? And what you can do is set up the consent form so that you are paid a certain amount per day that you complete. And that way it's $3 a day. And so in this case, if you finish 3 days, you have $9. And that saves your budget a little bit for the science, and it's also an incentive for the participants to continue throughout the study. I've been referring to consenting, and informed consent is a critical part of the process. And what that consent essentially does is guarantee that the participant understands what they're becoming involved in. And so think of consenting as a process, not a piece of paper. So they will sign a piece of paper, but you may have to revisit some of the material, and that piece of paper could be torn up halfway through the study. The participant could say, I don't want to be in this study. So, but consenting is really important. And what it has to really emphasize is the participation is voluntary. Refusing participation has no penalty or loss of benefits, in particular in medical studies. An individual who's receiving an experimental drug, they should absolutely be permitted to drop out of a study and still receive treatment as usual, the typical treatment, and that has to be guaranteed for them. You can withdraw at any time, and you can choose not to answer any of the questions. So you could complete 5% or 95% of the study. It's really up to you as a study volunteer. And so the IRB really focuses on when you submit your study, the levels of relative risk to the participants. So more than minimal risk, not covered under review categories. So intervention studies, physical or emotional discomfort, sensitive data, that's the top triangle there is full board review. Expedited review would be not greater than minimal risks. There's some expedited review categories that are a little different for each IRB depending on your institution. And an exempt is often for research with de-identified records. So it's an old database that you're using and you can't identify the individual. You still submit, but it would be an exempt. It'd be a quick review. So the amount of time and paperwork involved in IRB review really depends on the level of exposure and risk to the subjects. I will go through this relatively quickly, but deception, or in other words, not telling the participant exactly what will happen in the study can be used, but it really needs to be, it's only really acceptable if it's justified by the study's significant scientific value and non-deceptive alternative procedures are not feasible. And the deception does no harm. So you can't deceive someone and leave them with physical or emotional distress, physical harm, emotional distress afterward. The deception should be something that really couldn't harm the individual. And during the informed consent, where you are required to tell all participants exactly what will happen, you might be able to leave out key conditions that would be somewhat deceptive. But then after the study, you need to explain any deception as early as possible. So if it's a longitudinal study, at the end of the last arm, if that's required, and it's no later than the conclusion of the data collection. And you have to permit participants to withdraw their data from further analysis if they were unhappy with the deception used. So just a couple of comments about ethics and power differentials. And these are just two columns of different things that you might encounter, different situations. And the ultimate point or goal is that to think about how you might discuss any of these issues with your lab PI, your advisor. And hopefully you're in a situation where you can talk to the advisor about things going on in the lab. And if you find that you can't, there's often an ombudsman or other individuals who you can speak to if there are things that are going on in a lab that you're uncomfortable with. For example, is it okay to change the method protocol without IRB approval? No, you need to submit all changes to the IRB. Is it okay not to give participants payment if they left early? It really depends on the consent form, right? Again, everything is a signed contract with that participant about what their expectations are of the study. Is it okay to skip the consent form process if they verbally agree and arrive late? The answer is no. You have to have a consent form. And then does what you might observe in a lab, or if you're being asked to do things you're not sure about, is it okay to have RAs set up and administer consent forms without their CITI training, city training, which is basic training that allows you to engage in the research process? And the answer is no. And should you follow up, or should you follow the approved protocol after you observe distress in participants? And this is a judgment call, of course, but if the individual is distressed, the observed protocol, the approved protocol that you're supposed to follow becomes less relevant. You need to address why the individual is distressed and try and help them. And the science sort of takes backseat at that moment. And so these are just a couple of things to be thinking about. And what is always good in the lab is having somebody you can talk to about things that are going on that perhaps you just want to talk about. Maybe there's a clear reason why something happened, but if you see something and it bothers you, bring it up. So, a summary about the IRB. The IRB sets ethical standards to guide our science and conduct human subjects research. That we adhere to their principles. An institutional review board are in place to protect study volunteers and human subjects. And if you are ever unsure if a procedure is IRB compliant, contact your IRB. If you ever have a question about an ethical situation, talk to someone in charge or someone you respect who can help you in your decision making. It's never a bad thing to ask. Yeah, the problems with ethical dilemmas are that, first of all, they're dilemmas. They're sometimes not easy. Sometimes the decision's not obvious. So talk to somebody. The problem is never in talking to somebody. The problem usually arises when we ignore it or we cover it. So anytime you're unsure of something, just reach out to somebody who can help guide your thinking or your decisions. Consenting. All human study volunteers should be given the right to consent to participate in research. Volunteers can discontinue any study at any time. A participant who discontinues a study should be provided a full stipend if payment was agreed to, unless otherwise dictated in the consent. Consenting is a process and a piece of paper, and pardon me, not a piece of paper or a single signature. So consenting can be revisited. It's not a single signature.